Welcome to the Hudson Institute. I'm Bryan Clark, a senior fellow at the Institute and director of the Hudson Center for Defense Concepts and Technology. I am joined tonight for this co-sponsored event by Henry Sokolski, who is the executive director of the Non-Proliferation Policy Education Center. Henry, thank you for co-hosting this event and being here tonight.
Well, thank you for continuing to co-host yourself.
Today, we're going to be talking about the prospect of nuclear submarines for South Korea in the context of the AUKUS agreement, which recently is agreed between the United States, the United Kingdom, and Australia to share nuclear submarine technology with Australia. The question has arisen as to whether other East Asian allies should be trying to get and receive submarine technology as well, and should they be pursuing their own submarine programs. We're going to address that question tonight in the context of AUKUS. This is a series of events that we've been doing looking at AUKUS and its implications for the Indo-Pacific region. This will be the third event in that series, and we look forward to having a robust discussion tonight about the prospect of nuclear submarines for South Korea. Future events will look at other opportunities for technology sharing between Europe, the United States, and East Asia, including Japan and some other allies in the region. So joining us tonight on our panel is going to be Professor Young-Jun Park from the College of National Security at the Korean National Defense University. He is going to be speaking on some of the benefits of nuclear submarines for South Korea. He has many books and co-authored articles, and he also served in the Korean National Security Council from 2018 to 2020, and in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs from 2015 to 2020. Also with us tonight is Professor Chang Park, who is from the Hongik University, who is also an honorary research fellow at KIDA, the Korean Institute for Defense Analysis. Dr. Park will be talking a little bit about some of the other opportunities for technology sharing between the United States, Europe, and South Korea that we could pursue and that we'll be considering in future events in this series. I'm going to go ahead and start, though, tonight because we want to talk a little bit about what the arguments for and against might be for nuclear submarines in South Korea. I'll go ahead and give what is essentially going to be the against argument. This is from work that James Campbell at Naval Sea Systems Command did, and did a great article in the Naval War College Review that recently was published. I'm going to talk a little bit about his report and also some of the work we've done at Hudson, which very much are in line in terms of some of the alternatives to submarines for addressing South Korea's undersea warfare needs. So the issue here is talking about maybe alternatives to nuclear submarines for the Republic of Korea. One of the things that's typically brought up, and this is something James brings up in his article, is the maritime environment around Korea is relatively constrained. So the benefits of nuclear submarines in particular, that can go over long distances and do long endurance operations, maybe isn't as great, because in these waters you're talking about only a 1 or 2 day transit to go anywhere within the region. The other thing that's brought up sometimes is the water depth, both in the East Sea and the West Sea. The West Sea water depth, as you can see on the chart here, is pretty shallow, but still not too shallow for nuclear submarines, who routinely will operate in less than 300 feet of water. So it's really about the size of the submarine rather than whether it's nuclear powered or conventionally powered. And then the West Sea is much deeper and affords lots of maneuver space for submarines. The argument for nuclear submarines for Korea and submarines in general is generally going to be, can you hold at risk North Korean ballistic missile submarines, which may be a threat to South Korea as well as the United States and other U.S. allies? And then also, can you use submarine to interdict North Korean amphibious assaults that might proceed in from the north? So those are two kind of obvious ways you can use them. Obviously, there's opportunities also for South Korea to use nuclear submarines to maybe go further abroad and contribute to alliance operations elsewhere. But that's not traditionally been a focus of the South Korean military. And if the South Korean military wanted to start spreading its wings and being more of a contributor to alliance operations outside of Korea, then maybe a nuclear submarine makes sense. An alternative to going after enemy submarines using nuclear submarines would be to look at unmanned systems. Unmanned systems are a major component of the AUKUS deal. Unmanned systems are going to be part of the technology that's being shared between the United States and Australia. Excuse me. So this shows kind of a summary of how you could use unmanned systems to go after to do the anti-submarine warfare mission. Unmanned systems such as the SOSUS arrays that the United States has, relocatable sensors such as what we'll show later on, the transformational, relocatable, reliable acoustic path sensors or traps. And then mobile sensors like gliders or other UUVs can be used to tow towed arrays and find submarines. Submarines can then be tracked with sonobuoys, which unmanned systems can deploy, like the MQ-9 Reaper. And also they could be tracked by unmanned surface vehicles that could tow towed arrays and do that track and trail operation at a much lower cost and with much more scalability than what you can achieve with a nuclear submarine, which is a pretty expensive piece of hardware. And then engaging enemy submarines can be done with aircraft, which can launch relatively inexpensive and small weapons that suppress the submarine. So they force the submarine to evade and break off from its operations. But if you want to kill a submarine, then there's one place where you actually probably need another submarine. So if you want to destroy a submarine, for sure, you need a heavyweight torpedo, and that's generally going to be something that's only carried by another submarine. So the one part of this mission where a nuclear submarine or another submarine could be conventionally powered makes the most impact is on the destruction mission. And if destruction is necessary, then you need another submarine. Looking at this in a little bit more detail, just to kind of give some more explanation. The sensing mission can be done almost entirely with unmanned systems. So whether it's passive seabed sonar arrays like SOSUS, it's these traps sensors that look up into the water column using passive sonar, glider UUVs or torpedo-like UUVs that tow towed arrays, all of which can use passive sonar to find submarines. And there's also active systems such as the variable depth sonars that are currently used by a lot of frigates in the European navies, and the US Navy's frigate is going to carry. Which can be used by themselves to do low frequency active, bounce off the signal and return, or they can be used in a bistatic mode where the sonar is used as the emitter, and then you've got passive towed arrays that pick up the return and detect the target. So there's lots of ways to detect that transiting submarine that don't involve the use of a nuclear submarine or another submarine at all. And then when you get to the point of wanting to engage that submarine, well, then unmanned systems can be pretty effective there as long as you focus on the suppression mission. You can keep the submarine on the run. You can prevent the submarine from being able to do its mission. And it's a lot easier just to suppress them than it is to try to hunt them down and kill them, which is a much more labor-intensive operation. So this approach offers you scale. So if you're going up a threat like the Chinese, you really need the scale to be able to address a large number of submarines. You can't afford to go on the man-on-man defense that a nuclear submarine would allow because there's too many enemy submarines to try to track down. So this unmanned approach is something that could scale to address a larger number of submarine threats at the same time. One mission that's really challenging to do with submarines is track and trail, or once you've detected the submarine, how do you keep an eye on it until you've got the authorities to go destroy it or attack it? This is a constant problem for the United States because we're obviously not at war right now. But at wartime, it's challenging because a smart adversary will send its submarines out to do operations before hostilities have begun, denying the opportunity for a quick engagement by a ASW force until that submarine is well away from the conflict area and maybe is unlocated. So this idea of track and trail is something that unmanned systems can really lend themselves to because they are cheap. They can be built with relatively long endurance, and you can afford to have them tied up doing this track and trail mission while you take your manned platforms and focus on other operations that are maybe more important. So when you add it all up, and this is something James really brings out in great detail in his report, the cost of these unmanned systems for a South Korean anti-submarine warfare operation against the North would be comparable to the cost of even one nuclear submarine. A nuclear submarine on par with a Virginia class, for example, is going to be about a $2 billion plus submarine. Virginia class submarines are about $3.5 billion today. But if you look at something even, less capable than that, more like maybe the Astute, it's still a $2 billion submarine. Well, if you look here, you can pay for an entire unmanned undersea warfare setup that could do anti-submarine warfare against any of the submarine bases the North might have for $2 billion or less. That buys all your equipment, and then the operating cost is a fraction of what you would have for a combination of manned platforms. So that this idea of needing the nuclear submarine to do the anti-submarine warfare mission only bears out if you're focused on the destruction of the enemy submarine, and even then you don't need a nuclear submarine. You could do that with a conventional submarine. So that's the argument in sum, and we could talk a little bit about that during the Q&A. But with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Youngjun Park, who's going to talk a little bit about what the benefit is of nuclear submarines for Korea and why we should be thinking about that option.
Good evening, American gentlemen, and good morning, my Korean friends. It is my pleasure to have an opportunity to share my opinion on this issue with the virtual conference. Thank you, Dr. Bryan Clark, for inviting me to this important seminar. Even though I am not fluent in English speaking and I am not familiar with the technological aspect of the submarine, I try to deliver my message on the issue of nuclear-propelled submarine and AUKUS for the South Korea. Today, my presentation will be consist of mainly three parts. The first part is necessity of nuclear submarine for South Korea. As you know, South Korea is surrounded by assertive countries like North Korea and China. North Korea continues to develop its nuclear weapon despite some non-nuclear declaration with the United States and Korea respectively. After the failure of Hanoi summit in February 2019, North Korea resumed its submarine launched ballistic missile test, such as 북극성 3 in October 2019, and Pyongyang tested again 북극성 5 in January 2021. At the same time, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un ordered a very important message to the members of each National Defense Institute to develop a diverse strategic deterrent capability, such as nuclear-propelled submarine, drone, and intelligence gathering satellite, hypersonic missile, etc. So South Korea should respond to this kind of North Korean possible threat by developing our own strategic deterrent capability. In addition, South Korea should pay attention to the assertive military behavior by China. In the midst of Taiwan crisis, China frequently dispatched its military vessels or aircraft to the Taiwan Strait through the Yellow Sea. So in doing so, China frequently intrude territorial water of North Korea, crossing the West Sea. So this kind of Chinese behavior also poses security threat for South Korea, as well as Pyeongtaek base, in which United States forces are stationed. So it is the reason why South Korea should invest more on the strategic deterrent capability, and nuclear submarine can be an important tool of this strategic deterrent capability. In fact, South Korea already is equipped with 209 and 214 class diesel submarine. In 1993, South Korea acquired 209 class diesel submarine from Germany and 214 class diesel submarine in 2007. Recently, South Korea equipped with 3,000 ton class diesel submarine, and South Korea successfully launched its first SLBM missile through this 3,000 ton class diesel submarine. However, according to the South Korean submariner, diesel submarine exposed vulnerability whenever it resurfaced during the operation. So the South Korean government wanted to acquire nuclear propelled submarine during the Nomin administration and Moon Jae-in administration. However, the United States does not accept South Korea's request to acquire nuclear propelled submarine. At this moment, we heard that the news of AUKUS. I fully understand why the United States, UK, and Australia decided to conclude the AUKUS agreement. As for the Australia, in its defense strategy update, which was published in 2020, Australia expressed its concern about growing China's influence on the region. So Australia decided to develop its military capabilities, such as naval capability, aircraft, and cyber and intelligence capability. In doing so, Australia, United States, UK agreed to the AUKUS agreement. As for the United States, AUKUS implies the very important network among the allies in Europe and in the Asian region. In its Indo-Pacific strategy, which was published last month, AUKUS, United States explained that AUKUS represents one of the Union inviting allies from Europe and Asia region. However, to be frank with you, the news of AUKUS is a little inconvenient news for South Korea. As I mentioned, South Korea continuously demands the transfer of nuclear propelled submarine from the United States. However, the United States does not respond to it. In doing so, the United States decided to provide nuclear propelled submarine technology to the Australia. Why does the United States ignore Seoul's request for a long time? Whereas the United States provided nuclear propelled submarine technology to Australia. South Korea is less important ally for the United States, isn't it? I would like to raise this kind of questions to the US gentlemen. So in my view, South Korea has not shown credibility to the United States as an ally, especially under the Moon Jae-in administration. South Korea does not join the Quad, and South Korea does not participate joint military exercise with the United States, Japan, Australia, and India, like Malabar exercise and Talisman Sabre exercise. Furthermore, South Korea embroiled in quarrel with Japan concerning the historical issues. So I guess this kind of South Korea's behavior, diplomatic behavior, would irritate the US and diminish the credibility as an ally. This is just my guess. So in my view, recovering South Korea's credibility as an ally could be a very important step to make a favorable condition concerning the nuclear propelled submarine by joining the Quad and by participating in the joint military exercise and by improving relationship with Japan. These kind of measures would be an important step to enhance confidence as an ally to the United States. So as you know, next week there will be presidential election in South Korea. So I hope under the new president, South Korea could recover trust as an ally to the United States and make favorable conditions to get nuclear submarine from the United States. Okay, that's all. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Park. That'll get some good fodder for our discussion coming up. So I want to turn now to Dr. Chang Kwoun Park to talk a little bit about some of the other opportunities for technology sharing that the U.S. And Europe could pursue with South Korea. So, Dr. Park, to you.
Well, good morning and good afternoon, good evening. My name is Chang Kwoun Park, and professor at the Hongik University. It's great to meet you. Actually, I'd like to make some statement on general concept of how South Korea think about cooperation on regional issues. I think that basically South Korea is very open to work with the US and allies and partners on defense and security issues in the region. But as you know, there are some ambiguities in some areas South Korea take at the moment. actually South Korea does not want to antagonize the relations with China. So China factor is so important for South Korea to take any position at the moment. So South Korea, the Moon Jae-in government actually takes some position to like a new southern policy. Actually does not antagonize China, but actually connect to the U.S. policy to enhance cooperation on regional issues. So like the South Korea actually takes some action to enhance capability building in Southeast Asian countries, and so also participate at the multilateral labor operations and not operational exercise and training, something like that. Anyway, to some extent, South Korea actually joins some kind of regional mechanism to work with the United States and allies. But there is some quite a limitation actually at the moment. But next government, as Professor Park mentioned, maybe provide some opportunity to change the position. Maybe it depends on who will win in the coming presidential election. But the opposition party candidate actually strongly advocate the cooperation with the United States and allies. Also actually mentions maybe willing to participate at Quad working group, and actually Dr. Bryan mentions the kind of cooperation on technology and many other areas. So we can, but the governing party candidate is not so enthusiastic to pursue or expand some cooperation in some sensitive areas like the former the current government. So I think that the level and scope of the South Korean government cooperation on regional security mechanism will depend on who can win in the next presidential election. But in general, in principle, I believe that there will be no big barriers to enhance cooperation in the areas of technology, multilateral cooperation, and multilateral military exercises and capacity building. And actually, those areas actually the South Korea are very enthusiastic to cooperate with the US and allies and other partners, especially South Korea actually put the much high size of R&D budget to develop unmanned system and AI technology space system. So I think that there is no problem to enhance and so cooperate on those technology areas. So, but as you know, that the ocean environment in South Korea is very complex. Actually, the Bryan even mentioned that there is some good opportunity for AS operations on the East Sea of the peninsula, but as a naval, in my naval experience, actually I conducted naval operation in the area. It's very complex, even though the sophisticated modern weapon and system equipment can enhance or increase the possibility or for AS operations, but there is quite a limited in detecting, tracking, and doing some effective cooperations, AS operations in the area. But actually, the best option is to maybe to take early actions before those Korean submarine depart the harbor and very close area to the North Korean submarine bases. So not only technology, but also what I'm saying that there is some kind of consensus how to operate the ASW operations. So when we are talking about the cooperation on AS operation, we have to think about in more broader perspective, not only technology, but also the ocean environment and operation perspective, also the broad concept of regional cooperation or the South Korea, US, and Japan cooperation. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Park. You bring up some pretty good points there. I want to make one quick rebuttal or response is that I think you're absolutely right. West Sea anti-submarine warfare is going to be very challenging because of the shallow water. I think doing it with a submarine is actually even harder than we would be than doing it with an unmanned system. So doing anti-submarine warfare with a submarine in shallow water is very challenging, and you're probably better off using some of those unmanned systems we described in that West Sea environment. But before we go on, I wanted to be able to ask Masashi Murano some questions about Japan. But before that, Henry, please.
Yes, these presentations were really quite good. I think they're quite good because they show there's creative tension on how to think about these submarines, nuclear submarines, and the whole question of surface warfare, underwater warfare, sea control. All these things come to mind. Now, the word trust came up. And I'd like to just open the aperture on that a bit, because I think it's a very, very important point that we can't probably talk enough about. I think there is a perception, unfortunately, about trust in the case of South Korea when it comes to the word nuclear. And the reason why has to do with attempts to get nuclear weapons. Now, the concern there is if we get into nuclear submarines in South Korea, I think we'll be very quickly on the question of, well, how do you fuel these? And the answer may well be, oh, well, we need an enrichment plant. And the complication with things that have been reached in 1991 saying, well, we're not going to encourage that activity, comes to a head on, whether or not you want to accept North Korea having nuclear weapons or not. I think in addition, the problem of nuclear submarines operating, you're going to immediately get involved with the Japanese, who are right next door, to say nothing of the Chinese. And it's going to raise questions of, well, if you're going to go in this area on your own, how much else should we do with you? One of the things that was raised, and then I'll close out, is space. I think one of the candidates, the conservative candidate, talks about investing in space. And I noticed that our space command, the head of our space command, talked about inviting South Korea into the Five Eyes. There are paths here. Now, if the nuclear submarine made a lot of sense because you had to go long distances to transit to get to where you were going, or you absolutely needed it to project force, which, arguably is the case with Australia, that would be a much more difficult case. But I think what Bryan is arguing is it's a bad investment for that. So this is going to be a moment where the outcome, I hope, will be increased trust and increased cooperation, perhaps in some other areas, which will benefit the security of all the parties. Anyway, that's the argument and why the non-proliferation policy education centers co-sponsoring this, because there are other implications of this program that we haven't talked about. On that note, I said too much. I apologize.
Not at all. So I wanted to turn to Masashi Murano from Hudson Institute because I wanted to get a perspective from Japan on these potential developments in Korea. So Masashi, thanks for being here.
Thank you very much for having given me for talking about these issues and a great presentation of two of you. I'd like to make a few comments from the Japanese perspective. To begin with, there is still no consensus among the Japanese expert or the Japanese SDF expert community that maritime self-defense forces needs to nuclear-powered submarines. In case of Australia, there has a clear objective of the long-range ISR and the reaching the operational areas faster. But in the case of Japan, they don't have the clarified the mission requirement to our nuclear-powered submarine. And until today, the Japan's maritime self-defense forces diesel-electric submarine fleet has specialized in the very limited operations, staying near choke points and conducting a limited blockade operation in some contingencies happen. This is limited, but the very important mission, and it is believed that Japan has acquired the critical intelligence of the Russian, the Chinese, and North Korean submarines and their vessels. And the purpose of this mission is to protect the sea lanes by ensuring the safe maritime territories for U.S. carrier strike groups from the Cold War era. However, the Japan submarine fleet has never been envisioned to track and chase the Russian or Chinese strategic ballistic missile submarines in wider water or to take in on the ground attack missions. It's a kind of one of distinction between or role and mission, the capability sharing with United States Navy. And if Japan is to acquire nuclear-powered submarines, its mission requirements need to be more clarified. And it would be unnecessary if the mission were to continue as an extension of current mission requirement or current operations. However, if Japanese maritime self-defense forces submarine fleets is to begin the additional missions, such as ground strike missions, then the nuclear-powered submarine will be a more attractive option. And in any case, that the maritime self-defense forces is the most mission-intensive military services in Japan, and its readiness is declining. Today, the maritime self-defense forces not only has many operational demands, such as the missile defense, not only has the many operational demands, such as missile defense, but also the high-cost programs, such as the ISMO-class DDH modifications. So in this context, any new procurement of the nuclear-powered submarines will require more specific mission requirements that can reasonably account for the cost. So there is also the issue of the timeline of when the nuclear-powered submarines can be acquired, which is one of the major concerns of the AUKUS agreement. So in the absence of the clear mission requirement, it is impossible to determine whether Japan should acquire the nuclear-powered submarine or not. And however, ignoring this, there is the possibility that the call for the acquisition of the nuclear-powered submarine in Japan will grow. That is the acquisition of a nuclear-powered submarine by ROK. So this is not an argument backed by some rational reason. So, but simply in that context, the rivalry between a traditional rivalry between Japan and the ROK. So there is a possibility of some politicians and some public opinions will want to nuclear power submarines. And I'd like to quickly add the point of the potential possibility of the nuclear proliferation. And the nuclear, as the Bryan described, the nuclear powered submarine seems to be overcapable for the current ROK's defense strategy, from my view. For the limited anti-submarine warfare capacity or capabilities in the surrounding waters nearby the Korean Peninsula, as the Japanese submarine, our diesel electric submarine with the lithium-ion batteries are already sufficient. In the first place, the reason for pursuing the submarine-launched ballistic missile and its launch capability of the ROK submarines is the confusing to me. Certainly that the submarine is the survivable and invulnerable, but with the only 6 or some couple of the vertical launch system from these submarines, I think that it is difficult to mount up the effective counterforce or counter-barrage strike against North Korea. Except only one exception is if these missiles carry the nuclear warheads. So from this standpoint, the strategic rationalities, I'm a little bit concerned, or I'm guessing, maybe I'm wrong, but it's kind of the extension of the ROK people's desire to possess the nuclear powered submarine, maybe a potential desire to arm itself with the nuclear weapons. So this potential concern could trigger nuclear cascade in Northeast Asia. I believe that there is little need to Japan to arm itself with nuclear weapons, and that should not do so from my personal perspective. But if it were to do so, I think that the decisive factor would not to be China, not to be North Korea, but it is ROK. If South Korea were to go nuclear, or if it were to seek the nuclear sharing arrangement with United States or reintroduction of forward deployed nuclear weapons, of course that I don't believe that US government will easily accept it, but if would not to be a rational conclusion, but I do not have the confidence to discourage the Japanese people or part of politicians from going to the same direction or same conclusion as the South Korea. That's my current perspective of the two different but related subject. Thank you so much. I'll stop here.
Thanks, Masashi. So one point of clarification. So you think that if South Korea pursues a nuclear-powered submarine, but not a nuclear weapon-equipped submarine, Japan may or may not decide to pursue a nuclear-powered submarine in response. It's not clear that the Japanese government would want a nuclear submarine just because South Korea had a nuclear-powered submarine.
Yes, exactly.
But if they went to a nuclear-armed submarine, then clearly you'd have a potential for proliferation, the desire of Japan to
nuclear cascade. Yes,
right. So brings up. Thank you very much, Masashi. So this brings up a couple of questions that folks have brought up in the chat. So Dr. Youngjun Park, a couple of folks have brought up. So is the idea of strategic deterrence that you raised regarding the South Korean nuclear submarine, or is that because you're thinking that the goal would be to equip that nuclear submarine with nuclear weapons, or is it a strategic deterrent afforded by just the fact you've got a nuclear powered submarine?
Okay, thank you for questions to me. In this my presentation, I used the expression of strategic deterrent capability. In my view, North Korea already equipped with nuclear weapon. So South Korea needed to deter the North Korea's possible threat of using nuclear weapon. In addition, China's growing strategic weapons can be an important threat for us. So with the close collaboration with the United States, South Korea should a tool of deterrent. So, but under this situation, South Korea cannot develop a nuclear weapon. So I think more considering the possible strategic deterrent capability, more, for example, long range, middle range missile, or F-35 stealth aircraft, or nuclear powered submarine can be an tool of strategic deterrent capability. Facing the nuclear powered North Korea, we have to develop our own deterrent capability. So in this sense, I use the strategic deterrent capability. Yeah.
So you see the nuclear powered submarine as a deterrent or as part of a strategic deterrent, but it's not necessarily because it would have nuclear weapons. It's because it could threaten the North Korean nuclear ballistic missile submarines, or it could threaten attacks on North Korea from undetected or unknown locations. Is that it would, but it would be using conventional weapons. Okay. Interesting. All right. So so another question that was raised, which I would pose to you, both you and Dr. Kwoun Park, is where the uranium would come from. Henry brought this up as well. Is would this come from a domestic enrichment program that you would use to create enriched uranium for the nuclear reactor, or would this be uranium coming from the United States or a third party? So would the enrichment program in South Korea have to be ramped up to support this program, the nuclear submarine program? I'll start with you, Dr. Young-Chun Park.
There are two parks, so
I know, sorry.
Maybe instead of me, Dr. Park Chang-kwon will give more concrete answer.
Well, actually, South Korea actually discussed on the nuclear power submarine issues. We basically set the standard. We actually do not develop our own enrichment program. So we basically, if we purchase or develop build a nuclear power submarine, and basically we'd like to, South Korea would like to purchase enriched uranium from the United States or other allies. It's a basic concept. We with South Korea does not give some international suspicion on nuclear development. We are very clear to not to develop a nuclear program. But actually, South Korea has a very developed technology on nuclear reactors, and so actually for commercial purposes, actually South Korea has developed a small nuclear reactor program and technology. So if it is possible to convert those technology to the military one, maybe South Korea consider. But it actually basically I emphasize that South Korea wants to cooperate with the United States and other actors on the sensitive issues. But Dr. Park mentioned why South Korea tried to pursue nuclear-powered submarines, and he explains. Actually, there are still some discussions on what kind of repercussion this program can create, and so there is some concern and some pros. So South Korea faces very difficult conditions in terms of the security. North Korean nuclear program is developing so quickly and equipped with SLBM and also the Chinese maritime aggression ship behavior is very problem to South Korea. So South Korea need to some leverage how to options to depend or deter for South Korean security. Thank you.
Dr. Youngjun Park, do you want to add anything?
I agree with Dr. Chang. And in addition, I do not want that acquisition of a nuclear propelled submarine will be a bad effect on the close cooperation among allies with the United States, Japan, and South Korea. Our purpose to acquire a nuclear submarine is very simple: to deter the possible threat from North Korea and to deter the possible threat from China. So the precondition for our country to keep this nuclear submarine would be a very close cooperation and close coordination with the United States, Japan, other friend countries in the world. Yeah.
And this kind of goes to a question that Nobushige Takamazawa brought up, and in terms of the planning process and the information sharing and the need for a comprehensive approach to deterring North Korea between the U.S. and its allies, which I think brings in AUKUS as well, which gets back to something Henry brought up about other technology sharing opportunities that could improve the ability of the allies to deter North Korea using multiple approaches. So I think that so clearly you're both saying that the nuclear submarine is maybe an element of this, but is maybe not essential to deterring North Korea. There may be other avenues to achieve that deterrence because it's not necessarily a nuclear ballistic missile equipped submarine that we're looking for here, but it's instead a nuclear powered submarine. There's probably other paths to that. So one question I was going to bring up then, Dr. Youngjun Park, is aircraft carriers are currently an issue that's being raised by the South Korean Navy as something that they need as part of their overall plan for how they want to deal with North Korea as well as other challenges in the region. Would you see an aircraft carrier as an alternative way of being able to achieve that strategic deterrent as opposed to a nuclear submarine? And this gets to something Masashi Murano brought up because he raised the Izumo class and how the cost of the Izumo class may not be something that Japan could bear if it were to also be pursuing a nuclear submarine program. So what do you think about the nuclear, what do you think about a conventional aircraft carrier as an element of deterrence?
In fact, the issue of aircraft carrier for South Korea raised last year. So under the Moon Jae-in administration, the acquisition of nuclear submarine became a very hot issue among the Korean society. So Korean Navy organized a special committee to spread the idea of necessity of nuclear aircraft carrier, and I was included in that committee. but in my personal view, considering the South Korean strategic necessity, more important military asset would be nuclear powered submarine rather than aircraft carrier. To build the aircraft carrier, more budget will be needed, and considering the South Korean considering the seas surrounding South Korean peninsula, the use of an aircraft carrier is very limited. Would be very limited. So, as I mentioned, to equip with the strategic deterrent capability against North Korea and possible China, nuclear-propelled submarine will be more useful rather than a carrier. So under the very limited resources, South Korea should focus more important military asset like the submarine or F-35 carrier aircraft. Yeah, I think so.
Excellent. Okay, well, that makes sense. I mean, that's a trade-off that you'll have to consider. It kind of goes with if South Korea wants to see itself more as a regional player and is going to participate abroad in more military activities, an aircraft carrier might make sense. But if it's going to continue to be focused on the peninsula, then obviously nuclear submarines and aircraft carriers don't seem to have as much relevance. Let me check here. So one last question from Tomohisa Takei is the radioactive waste burden. I think the idea of the nuclear fuel cycle is already being addressed in South Korea as a result of their civilian nuclear power program. Is that correct? So the introduction of a nuclear submarine program would not really change the fact that the nuclear fuel cycle has to be managed in South Korea just like it does today. Is that true?
I am not fully aware of the technical matters, but under the NPT regime and under the South Korea-American nuclear agreement, South Korea should observe the required norms concerning the nuclear nuclear material cycle. So, that is all I could reply to the question. Yeah,
there really is a point.
Right.
And the point probably goes further than the question. The United States is encouraging South Korea to get into pyro reprocessing. And, arguments come and go, but these programs and the need for them and the rationales change. One of the things that people in the Navy do is they reprocess and recycle fuel. This process is very similar to what you need to do to get weapons explosive plutonium. Now, part of the problem is that we've kind of let the Japanese do this, and they are doing it and want to do more of it. Not commercially sound. So there's lots of kind of problems that you can lift the hood on as you pursue the nuclear submarine program that will come along. They may not be front loaded. You say, well, we're not going to do that. But once you get into it, it may come up. And so that will be also argued as a way of dealing with the waste for this civil sector, not even the naval sector. So these things combine in funny ways. I think one of the most interesting statements in tonight's presentation is a bridge into the next meeting. Apparently, we need to deter China. And this has come from the South Koreans who, the conventional wisdom in Washington is, oh, well, they have to be very careful dealing with China. But it's very clear that that's wrong, that we've heard from the Koreans that, no, we want to deter the Chinese. So one of the areas for high-tech cooperation with the Australians is something that former Prime Minister Abe was interested in getting involved in. And it had to do with AI and advanced computing. And the question is, well, how is this defense related? Well, it has lots of applications is the general answer. But, one of the things that I'd like this group to think about, and the Australians, the Japanese, the South Koreans, maybe we'll invite some Indians as well. Do we want to do something that the Chinese might be very concerned about, which is to be able to penetrate their IT firewall, and if we do, why would you do that? How would you go about it in general terms? And what kind of technology development activities would you engage in? We're going to try to get into that topic because as I see it, I see plenty of things about the strategy digital strategy of China. You can get a lot of free food virtually by going to meetings about that, but we haven't talked about what our strategy might be. Maybe we should, and we will in April. So we'll get back to everybody on that. Again, I want to thank everyone, particularly Bryan, for getting all of the speakers, and I think an interesting exchange. I hope we'll preserve the chat room comments as well. Some of those questions and comments are interesting, and to be continued. I understand there'll be an election on the 9th of March, and who knows, we may have stumbled into very relevant topics that will unfold after the election. On that note, I guess I'm done. Bryan, you should close out. You should close out now.
Well, thank you, Henry. Thank you, Henry Sokolski. Thank you for the Non-Proliferation Policy Education Center co-hosting tonight's event. And also I want to thank Dr. Young-Jun Park and Dr. Chang Kwoun Park for being with us today to give some perspectives from Korea. And I want to thank Masashi Murano for also giving us a perspective from Japan, and also for all of you to give your great questions. Great discussion tonight. I really appreciate it. And look forward to seeing you at the next event in April. Thank you all. Have a good day.